Hi, dear friends. Some words of Torah for Parshat Shemot. What is it within the Jewish psyche that has gotten us into so much trouble? Have we perhaps contributed to the way the world views us? First, let's talk about Jewish patriotism. In the mid-19th century, a British member of parliament expressed astonishment that any Jew would feel any sense of patriotism for any European country by making an analogy to red-haired people. And I quote, "If all the red-haired people in Europe had during centuries been outraged and oppressed, banished from this place, imprisoned in that, deprived of their money, deprived of their teeth, convicted of the most improbable crimes on the feeblest evidence, dragged at horses' tails, hanged, tortured, burned alive, if when manners became milder they had still been subject to debasing restrictions and exposed to vulgar insults, locked up in particular streets in some countries, pelted and ducked by the rabble in others, excluded everywhere from magistries and honors, what would be the patriotism of gentlemen with red hair?" But despite this argument, whenever given the opportunity, Jews have punched above their weight in emerging as political and community leaders and volunteers for the countries in which they've lived. Historian David Eberbach documents this surging patriotism that became most pronounced after the French Revolution and the great emancipation that resulted for Jews. His conclusion, however, is that Jewish expressions of patriotism had the opposite effect that one would expect. Instead of endearing the Jewish population to its countrymen, Jewish devotion to the state often led to increased anti-Semitism. You see, if it was possible for the strange and foreign Jew to so rapidly become a Frenchman or a German or a Brit, then this posed a problem to the nationalism of that country. If, and I quote, "within a generation or two, East European Yiddish-speaking Jewish peddlers could be transformed throughout Europe and elsewhere into citizens indistinguishable from non-Jews in appearance, language, behavior, and thought, how deep was national identity? To those, particularly Germans who believed in fixed organic national identity, such proof of the human potential for rapid and thorough change was as much a threat as the effects of the French and Russian revolutions were to European conservatives. Despite the growth of the secular state, anti-Semitism survived both in traditional and new racial forms. Had they learned Jewish history, the Jews would have seen it coming. The origins of anti-Semitism can be traced to the story of the Jews' enslavement in Egypt. Becoming threatened by the growth of the emancipated Jews of his time, Paro devised a plan, relying on the Jews' great nationalism. According to the Midrash, Paro used convincing rhetoric, a peh rach, a soft tongue, and called upon the Jews to act as volunteers to help the state build up its infrastructure. He came before them with a mold used to make bricks and started to fill it with clay. Who could stand by watching the Paro doing this without reacting? Immediately, every Jew eagerly came forward and volunteered their services. They worked with all their intensity and strength. At the end of the day, Paro then appointed taskmasters to count the bricks that the Jews had manufactured. He ordered that from that day forward, the Jews would have to meet the same daily quota every day. Why did we succumb so easily to Pharaoh's calls for volunteers? I don't believe that it's exclusively a matter of our insecurity or just wanting to fit into our parent culture. There's something about Jewish conscience which compels us to want to help. We have trouble standing by when others are in need. It is the goodness of the Jew, his aversion to evil and privation, and his willingness to self-sacrifice that impels Jews to set up hospitals and community centers to help the sick and underprivileged throughout our diaspora existence. And it is that inherent goodness that has been exploited so many times throughout Jewish history. We've seen it in our own lifetimes. Over the years, many Jews with very kind and compassionate hearts have expressed support and sympathy for so many needy people, even toward those who would see us driven into the sea or completely exterminated. It is this sense of conscience that is being exploited to this day. Name one other country that is fighting a defensive war after its civilians were so horribly massacred that is expected to act with restraint and proportionality. Name one other country that is being blamed for the deaths of civilians who, after being told by Israel to evacuate, have been blocked by their own leaders, forcing their own citizens to be killed purely for the objective of making Israel look bad. Anyone else come to mind? I didn't think so. But let's also learn from history. There was one tribe that was never enslaved. That was the tribe of Levi. We learn this from a verse at the end of the Parsha when Paro, annoyed with Moshe's initial demand to liberate the Jews, refused and then said to Moshe, Lechu lesivlotechem, go back to your hard work. Rashi comments that the hard work that Paro was referring to was not slavery, since according to tradition, the Levite tribe was never enslaved. Rather, Paro was simply telling Moshe and Aharon to busy themselves at home so that they would leave him alone. Why were the Levites never enslaved according to tradition? Da'at Zekenim cites a midrash that depicts that fateful day when Paro called upon the Jews to volunteer and fulfill their patriotic duty. We're destined to work in the temple, reasoned the Levites. No way will we work for this evil man, no matter how much he's willing to pay us. It was that sense of pride in their unique calling and their holy future that prevented the tribe of Levi from falling into Paro's trap. They acknowledged to themselves, we're different, and we will not allow our own insecurities and desire to fit in to compromise our special, unique identity. In 1943, Hannah Arendt, who would eventually become a prominent political philosopher in America, bitterly described a certain kind of Jewish refugee, whom she coined Mr. Cohen from Berlin. He was 150% German, and then in 1933 found refuge in Prague, where he became a convinced Czech patriot. Then in 1937, when the Czech government expelled its Jewish refugees, he fled to Vienna, where a definite Austrian patriotism was required. But the Anschluss forced him to flee again to Paris, where, though he could not get a residence permit, he nevertheless prepared himself for assimilation as a Frenchman by identifying himself with our ancestor Vercingetorix, who was a medieval hero of the French. As Eberbach concludes, truth stranger than fiction was the sad case of German Jewish nationalists, who would have joined the Nazi Party had they been let in. In the end, Jewish identity, even if long abandoned and forgotten, was wrenched from the past and presented to them as a death warrant. The next time you hear someone demanding a ceasefire from Israel or accusing our soldiers of genocide, think about the Levites who were able to overcome their own insecurities in Paro's face. If we had more confidence in who we are, we could have avoided being enslaved in Egypt. We can and must avoid future tragic iterations of the Jewish people by standing up to the Paros of today so that our enemies will never have another chance to enslave or murder us again. Be proud of our soldiers and be like so many who, when they see a chayal, pay for their dinner. May we see, dear friends, days of peace and redemption very soon. Bimheira b'yameinu amen. Here's wishing you a beautiful Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.